А у меня просто это. Да. Я могу настроить.
Помните, мы еще тогда можем наверное,
Слушай, там надо включить его.
странная история.
Сейчас.
Все.
Ага. Добрый вечер, Марк. Добрый вечер.
Добрый день.
Да, у вас
Добрый день. Это не вечер, но хорошо.
Ну, у нас такой ранний вечер.
Понятно, да.
5 часов. Мы начинаем нашу сегодняшнюю завершающую первый день лекцию. Лекция Марка Бассина. Марк профессор в университете Упсала, в университете Судерторна. Наш ведущий ученый по мегагранту «Человек в меняющемся пространстве Урала и Сибири», в рамках, в том числе которого эта школа проходит организованно. Вот. Ну и один из, наверное, очень видных и важных специалистов по воображению пространства, особенно сибирского, имперской географии, возможно, я...
Понятно, да.
Да. Вот. Наверное, я готов передавать слово. Я думаю, что...
Скажи, что лекция на английском.
Да. Лекция у нас будет... Марк выступает на английском, но вопросы, как я понимаю, Марк, можно и на русском задавать. Да. Я думаю, что лекция сколько? 45 минут примерно, да?
Да.
Потом 30-45 минут, вопросы, какие-то суждения, дискуссия. So now I like to give you the hand.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Mafier and Alexander and all of the other colleagues who've helped in organizing this first summer school in our project. And I'm extremely sorry that I can't be there, but we're having terrible difficulties with COVID and then with visas and other sorts of things. So we're working on it intensively now, getting the paperwork in order, and hopefully I'll see you in October. This is what I'm looking for, which is our next meeting, our conference in October. And I really am hoping very much to be there for then. I'm also want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak in English. It's easier for me on Zoom. I mean, I think when I actually am in Tyumen, it's easier to kind of общаться по-русски. But giving a lecture like this, I think I can do it more effectively. And it's not a bad thing also, I think, just for the sort of academic and scientific purposes of our project to have a little bit of mixture of languages. That's a good thing. And Zoom makes that possible. The summer school that you're beginning today is organized as part of a larger project devoted to the examination of spatial history and Siberia. This is an unusual sound, it's an unusual approach, perhaps an exotic sounding approach, but in fact, spatial history has been practiced for many decades. It's a very popular approach, and many people, very kind of internationally, globally, are engaged in different aspects of it. What I want to talk about today, what I want to do today is to give a kind of an overview from my perspective, which is a particular one. I know there are other experts sitting already among you in the audience who will then perhaps contribute their views on this in our discussion. But I'll give you my overview of spatial history, some general elements of it, and try to give some sense of what this approach involves. And it's going to be a fairly conceptual talk, not too many examples. I'm going to be speaking about ideas and concepts. I can begin with the question, logically, what is spatial history? Что это такое? When you've heard about it. As I said, there are different perspectives on it, but generally answers tend to point to the fact that history always operates in a spatial framework, a spatial context, on the one hand, and in some way history always is considering dealing with or confronted with interactions between society and space. So the spatial history, then given these interactions, spatial history becomes the history of these interactions, the story of this interaction over time. Now, this is a very adequate, I think there's nothing wrong in what I've just said. I think it's all accurate, but logically it's problematic, because if you take that approach to it, then logically all of history becomes spatial history. Now, maybe some practitioners want to make that argument, and I can let them do that. But I think for our purposes, a more useful approach is to try to be a little bit more specific and to say that spatial history is a history in which space is not merely all present, it's not merely there always, but it's those particular historical stories where space is important, where we want to emphasize the spatial factor, not simply say it's there. If everything happens in a dimension in that sense, but rather that it's somehow important. It's important analytically, it's important kind of epistemologically. So this is how I want to begin by trying to unpack this idea of what is spatial history. Now, I would say, pushing this a little bit further, that the question that I just asked, what is spatial history? What is spatial? It might seem like the main question, like the most important one, but actually it's not the most important one. I think there are other questions that are slightly more focused that actually get us a lot further. And as I sort of get into my talk today, it's these questions, the ones that I want to emphasize. They're more focused, I think they're more important. So first of all, what do we mean by space? How do we understand it? How do we deal with it? What kind of space? Are we talking about question number one? And question number two, what is the nature of the processes? Let's call them spatial processes if you want. But what is the nature of the processes that we are studying? And I think these two more specific and focused questions are actually much more useful in terms of diving in and beginning to sort of make some sense. We don't come up with an answer at the end of it, but we make more sense out of what's going on, out of the nature of the discussion. So what I want to do in my talk today is describe three approaches to space or perspectives, three approaches or perspectives on space and on spatial history. And I'm going to focus on the differences in the conceptualization of space, differences in understanding what space is, how it is treated in that particular approach, and also how space then functionally acts as part of a historical narrative. Because I think space plays very functional roles in this, and those roles are important. So I'm trying to kind of dig down a little bit underneath this very general question, what is spatial history? But I think it gets us further, but it's a bit messy, unfortunately. It's rather complicated. There are a number of nuances that I'm going to be trying to elaborate. And I mean, I've simplified my paper. It could actually have been more complicated, but I didn't feel that was useful. So please bear with me. Try to understand something, again, we can come back to in our discussion afterwards, and try to elaborate and maybe to clarify. In many respects, the differences that I'm going to be talking about in my paper between these different perspectives reflect different research interests in our group. Although I didn't actually write the paper specifically as a correspondence to what the group does, we've got a fairly specific plan of activities and research, which is broken down into different sort of subcategories. I'm not sort of going to reflect that in a one-to-one correspondence, but nevertheless, the more general kind of ideas that I'm going to be developing, I think are quite significant in a fundamental sense for what we are doing in our project. Okay, so as I said, I want to talk about three approaches or three perspectives on spatial history, on space. And the first is the notion of space as, well, I call it here external physical reality. You can, well, we're going to refer to that in this talk as material space. This is the real existing geographical environment, the environment that we live in, and inside of which, in a sense, this three-dimensionality inside of this history is played out. This is a space that you can touch, you can feel it, you can take pictures of it, you can walk around in it, you can run in it, you can smell it perhaps. This is, you might say, again, material space, a kind of objective space. Now this takes two different, well, it takes at least two different forms. So these are the ones that are important for us. On the one hand, of course, you have here the natural environment. So mountains, what I've just said is a rather philosophical way of talking about mountains and lakes and forests and deserts and fields and rivers and all other aspects of the natural environment, but it also includes the built environment. That is an anthropogenic environment, an environment that's been constructed by society. And usually when we talk about the built environment, and certainly in this, in our project, when we talk about the built environment, we're talking about cities. We're talking about urban spaces as sort of, paradigmatic examples of this kind of social construction of space. But despite the fact that it's anthropogenic in origin, it's not natural in origin, still the built environment can act like an external material environment. So there is a interesting resonance between these two that are so different in other ways, but in this functional sense, they can be similar. And the built environment, I think, although I've never entirely understood this expression, I'll confess to you what it's meant, but there's this notion of the built environment as second nature. And I've never quite understood, but possibly it refers, at least among other things, it refers back to this idea that it can have the same functional significance and effect as the natural environment. Now, in this version of spatial history, material space is understood as operating as a kind of autonomous historical agent. So the space itself is seen as playing an independent, as kind of autonomous, independent role in historical development. And it does this by shaping or determining, is a term that I'm going to use a lot. That's a term that's used a lot in this connection, by determining the societies that inhabit it. And this is a very old and kind of, I don't want to call it noble, but it's a very old perspective. And it has a series of names that specifically, so when you see references in the literature to this, you'll recognize what is going on here. You have, of course, you have geographical determinism is one name, environmental determinism is another, environmentalism, here are three words that are, three designations that are used all the time for what I'm talking about. Another less often used one, but quite interesting, geographical materialism, because there was actually a Marxist angle on this at one point, and they decided that to emphasize the materialist element of it is very important. So all of these perspectives refer essentially to the same thing. Now, it's a perspective that's very much with us today, and it comes back. It's it's been very controversial recently. We can talk. I'm not going to go into those controversies. We can talk about them in the discussion. It's still around today, kind of as it's experiencing a bit of a comeback today, and I have a feeling that comeback is probably going to become more pronounced as the different crises that we're now living through become move more to the center of our attention. But environmentalism was a much stronger and kind of more universal perspective in the 19th, about a century ago, about a century and a half ago, in the 19th and the early 20th centuries. And I would suggest, although this would be an interesting argument to have, I would suggest that at that time, it was really the only form of spatial history. There are other forms that I'm going to talk about today, but this was the only form at that time. It was very popular in its day. It was in history, but actually, I just want to say that in terms of the evolution of this, the origins of this perspective, human geography was quite important. The geographical determinism is something that really, I think the name was probably given by geographers. I come from the field of human geography, and this is something that I kind of grew up with very much as I was a student. But historians, of course, has been fundamental, and in a way, the historians are the ones that have created the best work in this, the most significant work. Certainly, the work I'm going to be talking about here is the work of historians, and not primarily historians, and not ultimately geographers. And interestingly enough, and again, something that it would be very interesting to pursue a little bit in our investigations in our project, it was Russian historians that the Russian school of environmentalism, and there were different schools of environmentalism in Russian historiography, were very strong. And it's an interesting question to ask, why was it the case that this perspective was so appealing in Russian in this period? The leading historians of the 19th century, historians like Sergei Mikhailovich Solovyov, Vasily Kluchevsky, of course, you've heard about, the brilliant Siberian scholar and historian Afanasy Shapov from Irkutsk, Afanasy Prokofyevich Shapov. All of them were environmentalists in some degree, and they're all interested in how Russians physical environment, how its material space or parts of it shaped Russia's historical experience, how it conditioned the particular political and economic character of the state and the society. And in the environment, again, it's this kind of determinism. In the environment, they found the ultimate key for explaining the nature and the character of Russia, although they did it in different ways. If you've read their work, you know, they're actually rather different, but nevertheless, they're all pursuing this premise. They all wrote spatial histories in which the material space was the primal, the causal determining factor that explains Russia's historical development. One of the important reasons that was attached to spatial history as environmentalism, this environmentalist perspective, was methodological. This is one of the strong appeals of this. I just want to mention this because I think it's an important fact in understanding it historically. I mentioned the 19th century. These historians lived in an age that venerated natural science. They looked up to it very much. What we call today, they didn't have the term so much at the time, but the humanities and social sciences all looked up to the natural sciences that in the 19th century were experiencing such great progress, biology, chemistry, and other subjects as kind of models. And this was the real core of intellectual development and scientific explanation. And they thought that the environmentalism was a way that they could make history into this type of a pursuit, because spatial history considers objective and material space as a prime causal factor. This gave a sense of scientific objectivity because you could identify kind of empirically what you would call cause and effect, and you could then get a kind of scientific explanation for this. And this then was a powerful attractive factor. A little bit, they viewed history, and you can see this in their writings, they talk about it, they viewed history like a laboratory. They thought that, well, we can do these historical investigations, and basically we're coming up with scientific understandings of how history operated, how it developed. They believed it was a rigorous scientific form of analysis, and they really believed that out of using on the basis of environmentalism, on the basis of this sort of causation based on material space, that they could make a hard science, what we would call today a hard science, out of history. Now, you can see this sort of logic and this approach quite clearly. I just want to take one example and go through that in a few words, because I think it's quite interesting and revealing for what I'm talking about. We can look at a particular environmentalist narrative. And as an American, if there are any Americans listening, you might immediately guess where I'm going to be coming from historically, because this is such a central element of this environmentalism is such a central element of American historiography. This is the celebrated notion of the frontier thesis. Now, it's American, I'm talking about American, but this was very much a universal approach. In the 19th century, colonization was a universal process. All of the developed societies, many of the what we call today developed societies, the Western societies, were undergoing processes of colonization. Countries around the world were expanding. They were expanding by gaining colonies beyond their borders, of course, in Europe, in Africa, and in Asia, but they were also expanding settlement areas internally. This was also a universal process. It was happening in North America. It was happening in South America. It was happening in Europe. It was happening in Eurasia. It was really across the globe at this time. And what I'm talking about in this particular example is this process of internal colonization, of movement and colonization within national boundaries. And it goes down, and it's been made famous in a way in the American example, in American history, as the so-called frontier hypothesis, but really a universal process. Historians treated the experience of frontier colonization, that is, the settlers moving across and interacting with and being influenced by this, by the space that they were occupying, as a form of sort of a determining process that shaped the evolution of a nation. Frontier interactions, movement, and settlement across space, a causal factor that explained the development of the nation, or in important ways explained the development of the nation. And you have a really excellent example here of spatial history, which is in a broad sense what we're talking about, in the form of an environmentalist or geodeterminist interpretation, how you get a kind of a causal balance or a causal dynamic, perhaps, between these various elements that is actually extremely compelling and seems reasonable in many ways, depending a little bit on how it's presented, but nevertheless, it seems it's not an unreasonable proposition that I think we can all react to. The idea that the external environment is a formative influence. We can't overcome it. We can't change it. We simply kind of are influenced by it and shaped by it. And then this as the explanation of national development. And the historians that proposed this theory believed, as I said a moment ago, that what they were doing was science. They believed this was not just correct. They believed that this methodologically was a way in which you could make a sort of a humanistic study, like history would no longer be humanistic. Now it could be like almost, as I said already, a kind of laboratory science, like natural science. But if you look carefully at environmentalism and this whole episode of this type of historiographical kind of theorizing about environment and society centered on the process of colonization, this whole interpretation ultimately is actually completely subjective. The notion of it being hard science, of course, has no basis. This is a complete illusion. And in fact, what you're talking about here is something that is entirely subjective. And if we just take a little bit of a closer look and compare how these processes were explained in two different national contexts, we can see quite clearly, immediately actually, what the subjective nature of these interpretations. And the two countries I want to compare here are the United States on the one hand, where you have, as I said, this kind of notion of frontier hypothesis, and Russia, which also had its, it didn't call them frontier hypotheses, of course, but it had this type of perspective, it had this type of explanation, and in ways were quite striking parallels. So in the United States, the environmentalist perspective developed really, I mean, it was in 19th century American historiography in different respects, but it was kind of brought together and put together into an immensely powerful and kind of simple and convincing package by a historian from Wisconsin by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner, who, if you know American history, at least you probably should know about it. He is the one that gave the title to this, the name to this. It's out of his work. This name of this perspective comes the so-called frontier hypothesis. This idea that the United States as a nation is a product of spatial interactions with a settlement of frontier, moving settlement of colonization, of frontier. Now, in Turner's view, this was an extremely positive kind of, what he's talking about is an extremely positive circumstance, because he argued that from the frontier, the United States derives its greatest national qualities. It derives its popular democracy. America is democratic, so we all know that, or at least they did in the, you might not know that so much today, but they knew that certainly they thought they knew it in the 19th and 20th centuries. So where does this democracy, where does this kind of basic democracy come from? It comes from the frontier experience. It comes from these from the conditions of the material environment, self-reliance. That is a personal kind of what's supposed to be a characteristic of the American character, this kind of great inventiveness and self-reliance, independence, love of freedom, all of things really, in a way, everything, or the things that are the best about the United States comes from this process of environmental interaction and environmental influence. And the conclusion that Turner came to is that it was the frontier, this environmentalism, that made the United States different from the European societies, because basically he was trying to answer the question, America comes from European roots, how is it so different? And he points to the frontier and he says, that's why we're different, because of this different environment, practically. So the frontier is what made America different from the European societies that it evolved out of, and it is what made America better than the European societies. This, of course, is a nationalist. Turner, he's not making any bones about it. He's a nationalist. He's trying to describe what makes America sublime. This is what makes America great. And this was his answer. Okay, so that's the American example. But let's take a look at the Russian example for a minute and see how it was handled there. And we begin to see sort of, in my eyes at least, maybe I'm biased because I happen to be interested in this question, but in my eyes, some quite remarkable resonances, but also some quite telling differences. This particular type of spatial history, this environmentalist spatial history involving a frontier, this idea of colonization and of movement across internal expanses of geographical space, was also extremely popular in Russia. Maybe not quite in the same way as in the United States, but it was a very, very popular mode of sort of historical perspective in Russia. And the historians I just mentioned, Solovyov, Kluchevsky, of course, you're aware of that. Shapov, again, in a slightly different way. Shapov's kind of, the way he used this was a little bit different, but he's there as well. All of them produced versions of what I would call, of course, they never called it that, but what I would call a frontier hypothesis or a frontier explanation of Russia's historical development. And if we look specifically at Solovyov, who I've done myself, have done the most kind of focused work on, we have quite an interesting comparison with Frederick Jackson Turner. Solovyov's environmentalist narrative that material space, the space available for movement into and colonization of this material space that was part of the colonization process in Russia, exercised a determining influence on the development of Russia, on Russia's development as a country, on its national character. And the degree of influence, the strength of the influence, was identical to that of Turner. So they offered, if you read them in parallel, they were separated by about half a century. Solovyov wrote in the 1840s. Turner published his main kind of small statement in 1893. So they're separated by about half a century, but nevertheless, extraordinarily, they make very, very similar arguments as they try to explain and to justify this. Solovyov didn't talk about the frontier, of course. That again, the frontier is a kind of especially American word. Solovyov talked about prostor. He talked about our word for our project, пространство, for example. This was the Russian space, and it amounted to, the way that he used it and the particular regions he was talking about, amounted to the equivalent of what in the American context is called the frontier. So he used a different word, but like Turner, just like Turner, he viewed it as a causal factor, that here you have the main driver of Russian history, and it is a process of environmental interaction. It's a spatial history that shaped Russia's national character, that made it distinctive, and precisely like Turner, why is Russia different from Europe? This is also a question that Solovyov was trying to answer in the 1840s in the way that Turner was trying to answer in the 1890s. And space then becomes a causal, this frontier space, this prostor, пространство, becomes a factor absent in Europe, so they thought. Now that also isn't entirely true, but that doesn't concern us from their analytical standpoint. Factor that is absent in Europe, but very much present in these two colonizing countries at the extremes, at the western and the eastern extremes of the European community. So, and they were both convinced also equally, which is quite fascinating to see, given how far apart they were in time chronologically, that they viewed this spatial history as being scientific. They liked it, they supported it, they were utterly convinced by it because they believed that this was a way of making sort of subjective, as I said, humanistic, subjective and humanistic study by making it rigorous and making it scientific, not speculative. History now finally based on empirical facts, based on history that was objective. But the interpretation, and this is the final kind of the conclusion of it, you've got this great kind of parallel and this symmetry and resonance in the way that they argue forward, but the interpretation that the two came to was completely different. Because where Turner, as I said a moment ago, saw the frontier experience as positive for the American, for its implications, its effects on developing the American nation, Solovyov saw it as negative. For Solovyov, environmentalism, this material space, the space of colonization, these open spaces, the prostor in Russia, was the reason ultimately why Russia was behind Europe, not better than Europe, not in front of Europe, as Turner was arguing, but rather why it was behind Europe. And it was this process of movement, of constant movement and constant resettlement and resettlement and resettlement, which was precisely what Turner was talking about in the American case that was so good. And he gave very clear examples of that. Solovyov says this is a disaster. We had too much space. The space gave opportunities for movement, and this prevented us from developing, from setting roots, and from developing in a more focused and concentrated in European way. So he finds the source here of Russian backwardness. I'm not arguing for either of these historians. I don't think either of these explanations ultimately really explain, either of these sort of theories explain the national character in the way. What was interesting to me is how spatial history is being constructed in ways to respond to different national contexts, and how there's similarities, but yet great subjective differences in the way that this ultimately turns out. So you have here, I think, with these examples, a fairly good illustration of the complexities of spatial history. Okay, so the first perspective, I want to talk about three. The first perspective I've just described it with a little bit of detail on one example, which I think is very good. There are many other examples. Of course, you could talk about space as a causative factor, environmentalism in many, many different ways. This is the first perspective, material space as a causative factor. The second perspective I want to introduce also focuses on material space, but it inverts the calculus in a way, because here space is not seen as an autonomous agent or a causative factor, a causal factor in the way that I've just been describing. Rather the opposite. Space is now seen as a contingent subject of historical agency. Space here is not a cause. One might call it, in a way, an effect. Space is something that is itself acted upon, that is itself the recipient, the subject of external agency, the contingent subject of historical agency. Question is not how did space shape society, which is our old question. This is the Turnerian, this is the frontier question. How did space shape society? Now the question is different. How did society shape space? And the focus is on humans' agency, how societies shape the material and the physical environment. Now, precisely what this shaping process involved looks quite different. There are different ways in which one can look at this process of shaping space. For example, one kind of example I'll just mention, and this is the idea of the cultural landscape, which actually originally was a German idea, the Kulturlandschaft, but became quite important in Anglo-American geography. And I think more recently, it was not so prominent in Russia, but it's now become much more, there's much more interest in this now these days. And I have colleagues in Moscow who are very interested in looking at the Kulturnaja Landschaft. But this concept originally, it grew out of, once again, a little bit like environmentalism, human geography. It's not, by the way, coincidental that spatial history is so connected with geography, because geography actually is supposed to be the study of space, even more than history. So it's not unusual, but history ultimately does the best, does the real significant work in these areas. So the cultural landscape then originally studied how traditional societies, through centuries of thinking of peasant societies, kind of simple, what are called simple societies, how through centuries of habitation of particular geographical regions, how the natural landscape was reshaped through this experience of habitation, through the activities of these societies. They had agricultural systems, for example. They established field systems. They shaped the landscape in terms of the different types of cultivated fields. Perhaps they had irrigation systems, which also, of course, have quite profound environmental impacts. They built villages, obviously. That's become the cardinal landscape feature. They constructed roads and other sorts of transport means to connect them. Another kind of important element of shaping the landscape. They cut down forests. Perhaps they planted forests, but more likely they cut them down. They drained wetlands and did hundreds and hundreds of other sorts of activities related to economic, related to religious, to their religious pursuits that had these environmental implications. And that work that now it is the society that is actually leaving its stamp and imprinting the landscape. Okay, well, this is how this is how we can think of the cultural landscape in terms of traditional societies that do this. It's not planned. The traditional society is not planned. It doesn't have an idea at the end of it of what it wants to achieve. It simply carries out its pursuits and has this this interaction with the environment, but it's an interaction that has very obvious causal effects, causal consequences for material space itself. Alternatively, another way of looking at it, and one that is actually much more relevant, I think, for our purposes in terms of the project that we have, and this is this focus on human agency brings spatial history into direct engagement with one of the major projects of modernity. And this is the determination on the part of human society to reconstruct or transform the natural environment, to somehow, through actively rebuilding the natural environment, through reconstructing nature, you can create something that is better or more useful for social purposes. So if earlier we talked about environmentalism as kind of the concept for capturing this idea of space as a causal agent, here we reverse this and we can talk about, and here there are different, again, there are different words, the terms that we can talk about transformism, for example. That is this idea of transforming, this determination to transforming. And whereas in the Russian case, we have no good equivalent for frontier, here we have an excellent Russian term for this. That's actually my favorite in talking about this whole process, because I think it captures the concept most completely. And this is the notion of преобразование. And this is one that I think should begin to be familiar to you, even if you don't have a particular background in spatial history, but you can kind of begin to catch this idea of преобразование, of this transformation, this reformation, this reconstruction, преобразование природы, as a modernist project. It's a Russian term, but it's very much a universal process. It's equally important in Europe, equally important in the United States and elsewhere across the globe. And there are great parallels and a great deal of work. I'm not going to begin to try to summarize this as a huge amount of work that people do. It's one of the more, it seems to be, more interesting dimensions of spatial history is the investigation of precisely this type of spatial interaction, this second perspective that I'm developing. Now, everywhere, as I said, this is a universal process, and everywhere, despite languages and the different, and many differences in social organization, big political differences, two elements are the same. On the one hand, this transformation is done because of the availability of advanced technologies. So you have the power given to society through the technologies of the modern era that makes this possible. On the one hand, so it's the availability of technology, but it's also this belief in an advanced forms of social organization and control. And so transformism really is an equation where these two are added together. On the one hand, the availability of these technologies, and secondly, the belief that the society now has the rational capability of planning and carrying out this transformation that will produce what I just referred to, this transformed nature, which is better. And it's very interesting because, again, you have very striking parallels between, on the one hand, this was very characteristic in the United States, for example, and in Western Europe, that is advanced capitalism believes that, well, we have this capitalist kind of organization, this capitalist perspective, it has its strengths and it's going to remake the natural world in these ways, and it can do this. But in Marxism, you had exactly the same thing, precisely, even though they were so politically opposed, the same confidence in being at the front, being progressive, being at the front, being in a position to carry out these types of positive, progressive transformation of the natural world. This is nothing less. I push this very strongly because I think, even though in many, when you study it, you can't quite find this attitude, but I think the attitude is there. It's nothing less than the ambition to reshape nature itself. This idea that somehow humanity, human society, or certain societies, not all of them, but certain societies are in a position to be able to carry out these progressive transformations. And so another term for this, and another one that I like very much, is the notion of Prometheanism, from the Greek god, of course, Prometheus, who gave fire to humans who endowed them. It's this emphasis on technology, and that the symbol here being fire, the flame that is controlled, not the flame that's burning. It's a forest fire that you can't control, but rather fire that you're able to have in your fireplace, or you're able to light a candle and you can control it. And this is this great technological power of humanity. So this can also be called Prometheanism. This phenomenon, transformism, preobrazovание, Prometheanism, gives a huge importance, I think, to spatial history. And really, it makes spatial history, the particular approach, and again, this is important for us in this project. This is something we're definitely going to be looking at, gives us really to not put too grand a spin on it, but I think it really gives a key to understanding vital elements of the modern history of at least the Western world where this was carried out. So I think it gives us a very important. It's different from environmentalism in this sense, although I'm suggesting a kind of parallel in a strong conceptual sense. Nevertheless, there are differences here. Now, transformism is particularly interesting, of course, for our project, of course, and again, I anticipate that when I talk about preobrazovание природой, this is going to click with many of you, because this, of course, was a cornerstone of Soviet civilization. And this makes it particularly interesting for our purposes, and even more so, if that's not enough, if we just look at the locus of this within Soviet civilization, we come to Siberia, because Siberia was a principle, and maybe the principle, depending a little bit, I guess, on how you want to define it, but a principle is the principal focus for the transformist energies of the Soviet state over most, if not all, of its existence. And in the course of this, Siberian space was, of course, profoundly transformed. And again, I don't want to go into details here. This is something that we're going to be engaging with in many different ways, I think, in our project. But this particular perspective on spatial history that I just described, I think is quite vital, just to repeat, for understanding Soviet history over the period of our grant. And again, something that we're all going to be looking at and refining. I think there's a great deal of work that's been done. This perspective gives wonderful opportunities for collaborations and with people, because a lot of people are looked on this. So we really, I think, can do something very important here in what we're going to be doing. Okay, now finally, I come to the third perspective in my kind of taxonomy of spatial histories. And this is the concept of, this is actually quite important, although it comes last, and I might say slightly less about this than I'll say about the others. This is the concept of perceptual space. So if we have material space to begin with, material space that is a causal agent that actually can shape society, a material space that is the object of social ambitions for reshaping, and now we come to perceptual space. Not a material reality, it's not real existing, which was the case in the other two. Rather, here, space is something that is perceived, it is imagined, it is envisioned. It's often described in these terms. Imagined space, again, something, a concept that you encounter all the time. Constructed space, invented space is another one. That's a term actually I've used in my own work. All of these referring to the same thing. Part of this construction process of space is a term that I use a lot. It might not be very familiar to you. It's this notion of valorization, from the word value. And valorization means you give something a value. That's part of the imagining of it, is to imagine what sorts of values it has. This is a process of valorization of space, and it's quite critical to this third perspective, because space in this way becomes associated with subjective values, and space, which wasn't so much the case in this way in the other two perspectives. Space becomes imbued with a meaning. You don't talk about space as having a meaning when you talk about geographical determinism or transformism. Space does not have a meaning, but it perceives space. It has to have it. That's what it means, and you must know what that meaning, or try to find out and understand that meaning to understand the larger process. These meanings can be individualized. So one can look at individuals having sort of individual perceptions of space, but more often, and I think much more usefully, certainly for our purposes, without question, I think much more usefully, is that these meanings and these valorizations can be socially based. They can be based on groups of people, where entire groups of people actually share similar ideas and are moved in the same way and share the same evaluations. Now, perceptual space is not necessary. Well, it could be, I guess, but usually it's don't confuse it with fictional space. You have fictional spaces. These are non-existent spaces like Atlantis, for example. And I was trying to think of other examples of fictional spaces, but you know what I'm talking about, spaces that don't exist anywhere. Perceived spaces are usually, and I think for us, unless I don't know about some research that one of our colleagues is doing, for our purposes exclusively refer to real existing territories. This is real existing territories. These are real geographical regions, but these territories become significant really only in terms of these ideas and the values that become attached to them. And these values and ideas have little or nothing to do with reality, or maybe partially they're connected to reality, but equally or more they're not. And this aspect of spatial history is very attentive to that particular space between perception and reality in this case. Spaces, of course, can be interpreted or signified or valorized, as I've said, in an endless permutation of ways. And this is what makes this so kind of interesting and I think powerful as a form of historical analysis, because you have differences here. You have what an interpretive, or what I would call, now I'll introduce the word, although I'm not going to say a great deal about it, I would call this an ideological flexibility in terms of how one valorizes and what these valorizations mean that make it uniquely useful. Because while studying images and perceptions, spatial images and spatial perceptions might tell you very little, if anything, about the region in question, as I said, it doesn't correspond, even though there is a reality there, but it doesn't necessarily correspond to that at all. It tells you little about that, but it tells you a great deal, huge amount, and very unique kind of insights into the individuals and the groups that are doing the imagining. To ask questions about how space is imagined is one of the various questions you can ask when you're trying to understand what is the mentality of this group, what is driving this group, how are these, how are these group, what are the perceptions that keeps the group together? I think we're on to it. I really hope, this is my intention personally in our work in the project, will be to really focus on this particular area. It's kind of where I'm coming from. And I think that, again, as I was just saying, this gives us a real unique kind of opportunity to make quite a significant intervention, I think. I would like to think that, in any event. Now, the final point that I'll talk about, I guess I've been going on, so I'm going to be coming to the end here. I just want to make one, just talk about this question of perceptual space a little bit, a few more words about this, and to point out that the study of perceptual spaces is particularly useful and revealing for questions of identity. And again, identity is one of the themes that we're going to be dealing with in, I think, different ways. I don't think we've quite worked out exactly how we do it or kind of what this is going to involve. It's something that there's a whole group of us are very interested in unpacking. And in particular, I would say spatial perceptions are useful for understanding national identities. So, and again, identity, you have all sorts of different identities. And I actually think that there'll be different types of identities that we're going to be looking at. I don't think we all are going to be looking at exactly the same thing. But one thing that I look at in my own work, in any event, that I'm just going to end by mentioning here, is this question of national identity. It's a sort of study. It's a type of, I guess I never thought about it this way. It is a sort of spatial history, which I call the geography of identity. And that is understanding how spatial perceptions are part of larger kind of constellations of beliefs and prejudices and biases and hopes and desires that go into describing a national identity. Because a nation is, among other things, a territorial entity. Nations are lots of things, but they're absolutely territorial. And territoriality then becomes a central part of this kind of whole concept of nationhood. Now, territoriality is illustrated in different ways, and if I were to say to somebody, well, territory is part of a nation and territoriality is a part of nationhood, they'll immediately go for an atlas or a map, and they'll show the country on the map very accurately, and there are the boundaries, here's the territoriality. And of course, that's true. I don't object to that. It seems very objective. But insignificant, what I want to say additionally to that is that it's in addition to this objective form of territoriality or spatiality, if you want to call it that. Territoriality is perceptual. This territoriality as part of nationhood is perceptual. It's based on perceptions. It's based on valorizations of national space. And I just want to give you a parallel here. I guess most of you are familiar with a very, very excellent and influential book that was written by a Irish historian, a sociologist, I think he is, by the name of Benedict Anderson, called Imagined Communities. This was in the 1980s. I think it was 1982 the book was published. It's still part of the curriculum, central part of the curriculum today. And Benedict Anderson there is describing how nations, these communities, what he calls them imagined communities, he's talking about nations that are often portrayed and understood as being kind of eternal and kind of going back to primordial in their origins and have always been sort of the same in their development across history. He points out that in fact nations in very significant ways are invented. They're just, it's a belief, it's a perception that groups of people have come to share. And that brilliant insight of his, or his brilliant ability to formulate it in a fairly concise manner, has really given rise to many, many different fields of inquiry. And what I want to suggest, the reason I mentioned Benedict Anderson in connection with the point that I'm making here, is that part of imagining nations, part of imagining communities that Benedict Anderson talks about has to do with the space that they occupy. The invention, so one can talk in the same way that you can talk about imagined communities, one can talk about imagined national spaces, imagine the space of the nation. And as I said, this is probably my central interest. I'm kind of coming to the end here. This is my central interest in the work that I've done that brought me to the colleagues, brought me happily to my colleagues in Tyumen for doing this project. It's the aspect of, I'm interested in everything, of course, that we do, but it's this particular aspect that I think is particularly valuable. The same way that people understand the nation and nationhood in different ways, they understand and perceive national space differently as well. And by focusing on Siberia, as we are doing, this gives us, again, I've said this several times already, and I guess I am biased, so you have to sort of take that into the bargain, but I do have an interest here. But nevertheless, I really think we are poised, we are positioned in the way that we formulated this and the opportunities now that this grant gives us to really dive in and make a very significant interventions across a whole range of topics. Okay, well, I'll end here. I hope that I've given some sense of the richness and the diversity of this field. It's just a touch, and I think I have a couple of colleague specialists in the audience who will tell me everything that I haven't mentioned about spatial history, because there's a lot to talk about there that I haven't talked about. I haven't talked about, for example, environmental history as such. This was something I thought I would, but I thought it was better just to take the drier conceptual sort of breakdown that I've tried to give, and that puts us in a position maybe to then move on and talk about things like environmental history, which again are also quite close to, not close, they're quite at the center of what we are doing. And over the next several years, I think we'll be able to follow how the project works on these themes that I've mentioned in its explorations of space and history in Siberia. So thank you very much.
Вопросы, замечания, осуждения. Энди, ты это получаешь? Ну, если пока.
Can you hear me, Mark?
Лучше выйти.
Can you hear? Okay.
The hearing, the connections are not great. Tyumen has very many strong, wonderful points, but I'm afraid these Zoom connections.
Can you hear me?
Yes, right. Okay. Is that you, Andy? Is that you, Andy?
So I guess I'll just invite you, well, two things. I'll invite you to talk about the connection between environmental history and spatial history, and particularly this interesting thing about, this term environmentalism that geographers had.
Yes.
Or, that before the environment was conceptualized as the natural world writ large. that sort of it's just an interesting way of thinking about it. So let's get your spiel on the connection between spatial history and environmental history. And then I also wanted to ask about the sort of not return of scientific history, but return of concepts of space, right? And part of the reason that, Soloviev and Turner were wrong is that, for instance, space-time was not even conceptualized as the basic fabric of the universe, among other, many, many things so the idea of having a scientific conception of space that is then undergirds all of these attempts at humanity, bringing it to humanities, bringing it to history. The science has changed so much from there. So, I guess that's just an invitation to talk about anyone who's still working in that first vein today, who actually has engaged in how scientists understand space, not necessarily in a cosmic sense, but even in a sort of global positioning sense, like how historians use GIS and for sort of more spatial history in that first sense.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. They're quite big questions. And I'm not going to say a lot about, it's a very good question. I kind of invited it, didn't I, at the end, because I raised the question of environmental history myself. There's a huge overlap, I think, and perhaps we're just using slightly different terms to talk about things that are in many, many respects just interchangeable in terms of what's going on here. Talking about space, maybe I feel that I can speak a little bit more abstractly. And my talk was a very abstract talk. I think it was a very conceptual one. And I deliberately ended up, that's one of the reasons I didn't want to talk about environmental history, because I felt that I would probably just go, I only had 50 minutes and it would be better if I just went ahead and could talk about space. But I think that a lot of, but partly, okay, and another reason I didn't want to talk about environmental history is because I'm not really an environmental historian. At least I don't sort of in the first instance, because I have colleagues like yourself and many others who that's their trade is environmental history. And I maybe felt I didn't, I thought that an environmental historian like you who should be, talking about these kinds of things and talk about environmental history in this way. I felt there was a great deal of overlap. Certainly in the first two versions, when I talk about material, about this environmentalist perspective, this determinist perspective, where space is the causal factor, or the inverse of that, where space is being reshaped. These are both central to environmental history. So I think it's just a question of terminology that I talk about spatial history, but you could easily and equally accurately talk about environmental history, whereas environment can be one of these two forms of space. Even though you talk about environmentalism as being causal, that's just a particular usage of the word. What I wonder about, and I turn the question back to you a little bit, and this is an interesting question I have about, that I've always had or had for a long time about environmental history, is how do you deal with perceptual space? Is that part of environmental history? Do you consider that to be part of environmental history? Or does that become something else then? When you're talking about how sort of society or individuals or societies or groups imagine, and you don't care very much. You're not really, the primary attention is not really on the environment itself, but it's a kind of history of ideas. It becomes a history of ideas. Is that, there's obviously a connection and a closeness there, but does that fall into the boundaries of environmental history? And that's a question that I can't answer. I'm not sure it does. To be honest with you, through the discussions I've had, the books that I've read and the conference panels that I've gone to where I try with sometimes these issues come up, I'm not quite sure how environmental historians understand space, maybe coming back to that. So in that sense, if it's okay, I turn the question, because I'd be very, very interested in your thoughts on that. And this is something, again, maybe we have all opportunities within the work that we're going to be doing over the next couple of years to go into this. Just more briefly about the return of concepts of space. I know what you mean. I guess a little bit in preparation for this paper, I did take a look at, so Google spatial history. So you do come up with, you're right, you come up with people, a lot of work. It's very often based on urban environments, though, and come up with. I don't exactly follow that. If a historian finds GIS to be, a powerful, necessary tool for the sorts of work they do, that I get, yes, I understand why you would want to call that spatial history. I don't even exactly, I just am achieving a little bit of a distance from that. I don't quite know, what sort of history then that becomes. And in fact, when I opened my talk and I said, what is spatial history? And then I said it was just sort of history operates inside a spatial, in a spatial framework, in the framework of space, and said that wasn't very useful. That definition I kind of got from that Googling and from sort of looking at seeing how spatial history is interpreted. So I don't have a good answer for that because I don't do it myself. I don't use GIS. Obviously it's a powerful tool. And I think that if someone who does do that has to answer that question. Now, finally, you mentioned the return of environment. I mentioned it, and you mentioned the return of environmentalism, which I think is very important. And again, in some way, it might be part of our work to the extent that it's relevant within the framework of our Siberian studies. But I see that, what I know about that, and again, maybe not as much as other specialists, but what I know about that is in some ways it really resonates. There is this sense of causality and the sense of, well, we can't think that we can change this, but we have to understand natural processes, and ultimately we have to live within natural processes, and these are the limits that are being set in terms of understanding the natural world. So contemporary environmentalism might be more, it might want to understand more the processes within nature that are operating than the people like Turner did. He never thought, or Solovyov even less, they never thought about the kind of natural sort of processes within nature. They didn't think about ecosystems in that sense, whereas environmentalism today is all about that. But this fundamental kind of almost philosophical approach of dependency and of causality, I think it seems to me to be quite similar, actually. Very resonant, at least. And sometimes these writers, and I can't give examples, I've read a little bit, I can't really give examples, but my impression is sometimes they're appreciative of this legacy. They're appreciative of this environmentalist or determinist legacy and some of the great kind of works that have been done in that field. So yeah, thank you for the questions, and I hope that says something.
Хорошо, коллеги, пожалуйста, еще вопросы.
Да, у меня есть вопрос, извините, что я так успеваю. Я написала его в чате.
Я не видел.
Вот посмотрите, пожалуйста, да. То есть вы говорите о том, что вот есть еще специфика такого существования пространства, как fictional space, да. То есть вы привели даже пример, то есть этой вот потерянной Атлантиды. Но это же для какой-то определенной функциональности у нас есть в наших нарративах, в нашей традиции пересказа, в нашей традиции науки. И как вот мне интересно, как вы, как мыслитель, определяете функциональность, именно практическую функциональность вот этого ответвления восприятия fictional space. Вот мне вот это вот интересно бы хотелось от вас услышать, если бы вы мне определили. Мне очень интересно.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. And I did understand it. Actually, I was making a slightly different point about I mentioned fictional space because I was trying to say that this perceived space or imagined space, like Benedict Anderson, imagined spaces are not fictional spaces. In other words, these are real regions like Siberia or like Altai or Amur. I've done a lot of work historically on ideas about Amursky Bassin, for example, which is a real space and it has real qualities. But the ideas that I looked at didn't correspond to a reality. They were partly a little bit, of course. There was always kind of a little bit of reality, but they were also. It was just kind of, you could think of it like a painter, hudожник, and his canvas, and he paints a painting. And I think of these. What I'm talking about with perception is really taking a canvas, which is, this is very crude. This is a very crude analogy, but it kind of gets the idea across. It's a canvas, and that the individual or the group puts their own images on it. That's how I would express it. Now, when you talk about fictional spaces, that's fascinating. I've not thought much about that. And if you see, again, in the framework of what we're doing in our project in a broad sense, this would be really very, very interesting to develop. That would
because I think we are coming. I'm sorry. Thank you so much. Because
да,
потому что это во мне возникает интерес вот с эстетической точки зрения, потому что сейчас у нас есть такое движение, как environmental cinema. И очень много якутских режиссеров, ирландских режиссеров, они приходят к primordial state of appreciation and terror and horror of this absolute. И как вы говорили, да, то есть вот это вот уважение, это, по-моему, если я не ошибаюсь, кантианский абсолют красоты, абсолютной красоты, да, когда глядишь на небо, глядишь на вот эти вот леса ирландские в темноте зелени, либо вот эти вот верхоянские горы, да, и вот почему-то сейчас вот такая вот именно тенденция возврата, образовательного возврата с образованием, как интеллектуальное кино, которое муссирует воображение восприятия читателя текста, зрителя. То есть каким-то образом они дают нам вот эти вот сигналы о том, что вот, мне кажется, вы говорили, о том, что есть функциональность, практическое восприятие, palpable, а вот этой вот fictional space. И вот это вот я увидела, и мне это интересно. Поэтому я вам задала этот вопрос.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's very fascinating what you're saying. And I can only hope that again, that we have an opportunity that the group and our project goes on for several years. So we have enough time and that somehow we can create opportunities to discuss these questions and to look into them and to focus on them, maybe as panels and conferences that come up or workshops or just visiting back and forth. So I would really like to do that. I mean, I just want to, on this, you've raised the question about perceived spaces and constructed spaces. And one of the, and I just gave you the example of the painter and the canvas. And I just should mention, because I mean, I talk about the American frontier and Solovyov, and this is work that I've done. So I'm talking about my own research here. And one other area that I've worked in, and I didn't mention it here, but I maybe should have, and certainly as I come to Tyumen and and share more with you of what I've done. I've done several studies of landscape art. And this is one of the most fascinating ways of how landscape is perceived. I talked about perception of landscape and construction, and one of the most kind of tangible ways is the way that people paint it.
Yeah.
And I've done a series of studies on the way landscape was represented and painted in Stalinist socialist realism. And it's an incredibly interesting and revealing, because when you look at the paintings and begin to understand the sort of the language, the iconic language that is being used, it gives remarkable insights into what was going on at that time, into understanding that particular society, and that, as I said, so Soviet civilization that took transformism as its kind of credo, and that wanted to do that. But what I discovered, as I always do, is that it was very complicated, and you had great ambivalence about transformism, and you can see this in the way the landscapes were represented. But I just want to flag that, and just the last point I want to make about your comments, just flag the value of things like landscape art or poetry, literature that's written about certain landscapes or about certain regions. This is everything what I mean. Maybe I should have said a little bit more about this. My paper is giving examples of the sorts of things I'm talking about when I talk about invented, because you might not understand, and it is confusing. What is an invented space? Well, these are the invented spaces. And what you were talking about also in Irkutsk, these are the invented spaces. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Спасибо, коллеги. Пожалуйста, еще у кого-то вопросы, комментарии. Ну, пока все думают, я задам, наверное, у меня есть два вопроса, вот, возникли у меня. Ну, есть вопрос про концепцию места. То есть для пространственного поворота, для очень многих, кто работает в этой рамке, вот есть разница, да, есть пространство, там, space, а есть
Мгм.
place, да, то есть вот
Mhm, mhm.
как эта концепция используется, как она соотносится с пространством, как ей апеллируют пространственные историки. И
Мгм.
второй у меня такой вопрос, ну вот вы, Марк, говорили там про, что есть really existing space, есть imagined
Yes.
space.
Yes.
А я еще думал и вспоминал про вот эту концепцию Лефебвра, про производство пространства,
Mhm, mhm.
Perceptual Space. Могли бы вы как-то тоже прокомментировать, вот, а как она как бы взаимодействует там с вот этими как бы вещами немножко? Вот. Спасибо, у меня два таких вопроса.
Okay, well, I can certainly talk about the first question. The second one, I maybe have a little bit less to say about. Well, space and place. I mean, one can get into a philological, into a lexical discussion about what these terms mean. What does space? And now we talk about sort of the English language. I don't know how these nuances and historical meanings translate into other languages. So you know, we really, in this case, talk about that. This was brought out in a book, and I recommend the book to you because it might be useful if you really are interested in this tension between space and place, by a former colleague of mine when I taught at the University of Wisconsin, a geographer by the name of Yifu Tuan. I don't know if you know about his work. He's a very, very famous historian, and he was a very famous geographer, very much a humanistic geographer, a little bit in sort of the spirit. Some of the things that I've been talking about here, he would have very much about perception, but he wrote a book called Space and Place, and I'm happy to send you the reference to it. And he talks exactly, he spends a whole book describing this. But his definition, you see, I'm thinking about what he said about that, and I'm realizing it doesn't fit so perfectly in the way that I'm talking about space and the way that I think, you know, space is used in spatial history. Because the distinction that he was making is that space, as opposed to place, space does not have any character. Space is, what's the word? I forget the word. There's a word. It has no character. It's just flat. It has no character. It has no particular boundaries. It's open. It's a field on which you can act, but there's nothing in it that sort of affects what you do. Or as opposed to place, which he said is a point. So space is kind of like an open, it's like two-dimensional, whereas a place is one-dimensional. It's in one particular place, and a place is meaning. This was his argument, that a place is infused with meaning, as opposed to space, which he said it wasn't. But this is, that's all I'm going to say about that, because it's not relevant. He wrote the book in the 1970s or 80s, and he was talking about these certain traditions in geography, about spatial analysis, as opposed to place-based, kind of more humanistic thinking. And it's really, so I think the basic message to you is don't get hung up in these words, because things like space mean, in particular space, I think, even more than place. Space means different things, and they're often even contradictory. So it can be quite confusing. And we probably, at the end of the day, maybe should, well, I don't know, we have to decide how we want to talk about spatial history even, as opposed to, for example, environmental history, which, although that's also not completely clear, but seems to be in certain ways a much better, clearer, crisper kind of concept for what we're doing than spatial history. So I think that we want to talk about that. So I think that the question, I don't have a good answer for your question, except just to warn you that the word place is going to mean many different things, and some of them will even be contradictory, certainly to what I've been talking about. Because in my view, space can have, as you heard me give my lecture, space can absolutely have a meaning. Space can be meaningful. It can be not meaningful, or it can be meaningful. I think it can be treated in different ways. I'm sorry, I know the book of Lefebvre, I know his work and this concept of the production of space. I'm sorry, I can't really comment on it. I don't know it well enough. And again, I mean, this is a sort of interest in the history of the concept of space. And these are like Yifu Tuan I mentioned, Lefebvre, who you mentioned. These are classics, sort of landmarks. But I think each of them is dealing with space in a different way, and they are the way it relates to what I'm talking about which is spatial history, I think is not entirely straightforward. Space is I don't like words that are unclear, although I use them all the time, and we have to use them, of course. But space is one of these awful words that just means terribly different things, and you never know, and you can use it against itself. So just let the buyer beware. We have to be careful. I'm sorry, I don't know that I've given a very good answer, but that's what I have to say. Certainly, we continue to discuss it, and maybe it's worth looking at it. Actually, maybe we could organize sort of something to look at it a little bit more carefully to try to understand, at least the dimensions of the problem.
Спасибо большое за развернутый ответ. Нет, по-моему, удовлетворяет даже. Коллеги, пожалуйста, еще какие-то вопросы? Да, конечно.
Well, thank you. It was very, very interesting talk. And I'm aware that my question can be a bit out of the topic of the space, but I still think that
okay. No problem. No problem. Yeah, right.
I hope you can answer that. Like talking about the Russian environmental sciences, like in this direction, and the space, and that's like post-colonial identities you've been mentioning. I was like thinking that Russian environmental science, especially like in my expertise, what I know about is like climate science. I know that like Soviet science did a lot in terms of global climate science and environmental like sustainability, but now it's like Russian science is muted. We don't see it a lot, like in like international negotiations, we don't see a lot of opinion of Russian scientists. And I was thinking like, if you think it is true, and how would you explain that? And I was thinking like in the perspective of this post-colonial influence, as you have been mentioning, like that, how was that? Преобразование природы project, right? Soviet project. Like, can we say that now like Russian scientists seen as the like servants of that Soviet project still? And do you think how can you explain like the servants of the Soviet project of the преобразование природы?
How can I explain what?
How can you explain that from, do you think it's possible to explain from this like post-colonial like perspective, that now, how to say that Russian...
Можно по-русски.
Исключение.
Как хотите.
Что русские ученые исключены, их не слышно.
It's a very bad connection. I don't hear everything you're saying, but go ahead.
I'll be very close.
yeah, that helps.
If to say it short, that Russian environmental science, I think in the international level, it's not really pronounced. And like the opinion of our experts, it's like maybe a bit disregarded. Do you think it is true in this like climate science and environmental science? And do you think it can be because of the like memory, like collective memory of the Soviet time, of how nature was approached in the Soviet times, like quite rude and yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Okay, thank you for the question. I think I understood a lot of it, at least. I'm not really au fait. I don't really keep up a lot with environmental science. I think what you're talking about, certainly today in the post-Soviet context. So I can't really comment. Maybe there are colleagues here who know more about that than I do, about that the Russian science has less of a profile now. I mean, what I would say, I'll just say something which is maybe not exactly an answer to the question, but just speaking about Russian environmental science and indeed Soviet environmental science. But some of the most key, concepts that we work with today and really throughout a lot of the 20th century come from sort of Russian, but I would say also Soviet science. And just to give one example of this, but this is something that I've looked at. This is the concept of the biosphere, which of course you all know, and I mean you associate with the great Russian, the various Russian scientists. So you have the whole field of ecology has had a, I mean, it isn't only Russian, of course, but it's had a unique kind of experience in Russia and in the Soviet Union, as you know, in particular, I would say, in the Soviet Union. And so these legacies, for example, what I was talking about of Prometheanism and of sort of what is ultimately kind of a destruction of nature, I mean, you can call it that in very significant ways, doesn't tell the whole story. I mean, it doesn't, and even if that becomes the dogma of the state, it doesn't mean that there aren't other sorts of, there aren't other perspectives and other interests, and that's been very much the case with environmental science. And I have colleagues, several of them who work on environmental studies of different aspects in the Soviet Union, and they very often, I mean, that's very much leaning on their work when I say this. But I mean, I'm myself, because I wrote a book on Leonid Nikolaevich Gumilyov, I know about the history of the ecology concept. That was very much at the center of Biosfera, was very much at the center of his work. And so I know sort of the history of that, how that developed. And the Soviets were making very highly significant contributions there. So I think it's more complicated than, and I certainly wasn't trying to suggest in my paper anything differently. So it's certainly more complicated legacy. That's my one answer to that the Soviet Union, this was very significant. And secondly, as I said to begin with, I don't really know about what's going on today in this field. It's not exactly my field, and I don't really know. So I'm sorry, I can't really speak about. I'm surprised a little bit to hear, and interested to hear what you're saying about the profile of the Russian scientists, sort of post-Soviet today, being sort of more subdued and restricted.
Hello, Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Very good.
yeah, thank you first of all for your lecture. I guess now it seems to me that we all have the perception of what is space. I have a more question. You mentioned like exactly 3 dimensions of what is space and how these objective, human and perceptive issues or things are related to spatial history, but I didn't hear about the time and temporal connection and how time and space are connected or disconnected, especially in terms of the 19th and 20th century. So this is actually what Andy asked about GIS, and I guess this is the instrument to see how time and space are related, because if we can, you know, create the map or GIS system of Trans-Siberian Railway, we can see exactly how it was constructed through the time and how it changed through the time. But actually, I'm wondering about what would you say about the connection between space and time in Russian or in global history? Yeah, thank you.
Well, I take your point about the about the uses of GIS. I was not in any way trying to say, definitely that's not what I was saying at all. GIS is a really powerful digital cartographic method and technology, which has uses everywhere. I mean, it has lots of uses, and it can be useful in history. But one needn't, I mean, if you were to ask me how time is relevant to what I was talking about, I would simply give you the examples like, for example, Frederick Jackson Turner, you know, is talking about a particular period of development. The time is there. The time element is in the way that he has kind of formulated the question that he's asking. It already involves a chronological or a temporal element. So time was there. It's different, of course, if you have GIS. I guess what you're suggesting is that you could sequentialize it. Is that what you mean with GIS and the Trans-Siberian Railroad? That is, you can simply sequentialize it. You can follow it from one year to the next year. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, sure, exactly.
About, yeah, right. No, I think that can, you know, that's one way of, you know, that's one type of chronology that you can have. But chronologies don't have to be set up kind of in that way. That can be quite useful. It depends, you know, and ultimately, I'm going to sound extremely old-fashioned here, but I really believe this. I'm sorry, maybe, you know, I'm restricted in some ways, but everything is in the questions that you're asking. It seems to me. How do you, what are you trying to understand? So what is for example, now I'll ask you a question because you've raised the question about the trans. I find that very interesting. I find that absolutely fascinating, actually, to think about what GIS can do with a project, a huge kind of spatial project, immense big geographical project like the Trans-Siberian Railroad that was so complicated. But what is that? What you've described, it sounds to me like you're just setting up a sequence. So it's a descriptive. You're basically giving a very detailed and kind of graphic picture of how this network grew over time. But are you, I don't mean, but what is the question that you're asking? If you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, sure. I'm just make an example of how the GIS can work with the connection between space and time. But actually, what I'm wondering was how space actually changed the time, or how spatial or how temporal boundaries or temporal dimensions change the perception.
Okay. Yes. I don't know the spatial history that I don't have a good answer for your question. I don't really know the answer to the question. I would be very interested in listening to somebody talk about that and to try to explain that, because it's not clear to me that there is that sort of, I guess that is maybe that is a dimension in spatial history today. I think it's already been mentioned by in the auditorium there. It's not exactly, as I said, I'm a little bit old fashioned. I mean, what I'm talking about is kind of recognizable. My examples are historical. To the extent that GIS, in my imagination, the way that I would think about the way GIS can, is going to be applied, it's in trying to answer, some kind of historical question that somebody has said. The GIS, does, at least as I see it, does not produce the questions. Do you understand the difference? The methodology or technology, the analytical technology, very powerful, of GIS doesn't provide, it gives you better evidence. It's another way of illustrating the evidence. It will point things out and give you, incredible perspectives and views of things that you never saw that way, and much more detail and much deeper. But at the end of the day, the historian has the responsibility of asking the evidence. Okay, what do you tell me? The evidence doesn't. The GIS does not provide that answer. I don't think it does, at least as I understand it. But again, this is something that I think would be. I don't know. Is GIS? Is this something that's going to be quite central in our project? I guess maybe it is, more than I realize. In fact, is that the case?
Надо обсудить будет.
Okay, right. We can talk about, again, these are I find this very stimulating. I mean, this is a good example of how a speaker like me can be stimulated in a discussion, because I hadn't thought about these things, but they do relate in certain ways that are not always that clear to what I was talking about. And I think this can be the basis for excellent, further discustions and interactions. And we have time to do that. We have the time and the opportunity for that. So that's really exciting.
To respond to some of this. All right, I'm just.
There you are. Hi.
Can you hear me now?
Go for it.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it. That's good. Thank you.
I'm prioritizing close space to the microphone. So just on the environmental history question, I would just want to quickly say, I mean, the question of wilderness and how it's understood has been part of environmental history pretty much from the very beginning, from the 1970s.
Very good. Yeah.
And so I think there's definitely a lot of environmental history that is in that perception category of nature. On the GIS question, I mean, the example that sticks out to me is Richard White's book, Railroaded, where he had a whole team at Stanford that had this spatial history lab. They did all this stuff. And one of the things they did with the transcontinental railroads was they were able to sort of show, actually, Los Angeles was closer to San Francisco in terms of tariffs, in terms of time to deliver goods, things like that, than like stuff in, further up in the valley, and much, physically closer to it. And that he was able to use that whole set of analysis built on, he wasn't doing it himself. He wasn't programming it. He had a team of doing it. But then that sort of helped him understand the functioning of the railroads in the west of the United States very differently. So that's just an example where, a historian has used these techniques, but then the book that he wrote is like, making fun of robber barons. It's a very, you're not seeing maps on every page of GIS analysis. You're seeing, more of a cultural history that's undergirded by the analysis, the spatial analysis
Yeah.
tools from GIS.
Yeah, no, that's of course. I know his work a little bit, and you're quite right about that, Richard White. But at the end of the day, the GIS, this technology is producing material that he then uses in his analysis. I mean, that's kind of would be my comment. The GIS is not itself kind of creating historical questions that that then are the ones that need to be answered. But this is I mean, again, this has come up quite a bit in these discussions. I mean, I think spatial history, I've only given, but I did say this at the beginning of my talk in my defense, I've really given one take on it. And there are obviously lots of takes on it, and maybe they're more contemporary takes. I don't know. I mean, maybe you've got the spatial history, which is, again, being driven by, to a significant extent by these technologies, that is quite different from what I've been talking about, where one has to worry about this issue of chronology and spatiality and how these interconnect at a sophistication, at a level of sophistication that I'm not really matching here. So that's just one more, desiderata, I think we say, one thing that we have to kind of include in our discussion. So thank you for that, Andy, for those additional, for that kind of dimension, that greater depth in these questions.
Спасибо. Так, мне кажется, кто-то в чате еще задавал вопрос. Нет. Нет, с чата не было. Может быть, кто-то, кто в зуме дистанционно хочет спросить, не только. Можно спросить голосом. Ну, да, в принципе, наши 1,5 часа подходят к концу. Я думаю, что, это как бы не последнее, наше обсуждение пространства. И я надеюсь, что когда-нибудь оно произойдет в этом месте, в смысле в Тюмени. Наконец,
Следующий раз.
Мы наконец встретимся. Вот. Большое спасибо, Марк. Большое спасибо, коллеги. Было здорово, приятно.
That was great.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Okay. Good luck for the rest of your conference.
Спасибо.
Bye-bye.
Bye.